Hi, everybody. I'm Youssef Amin. I'm a graduate student of psychology at NYU, and I'm going to be facilitating this talk between Jessie Cox and Johnna Wu. Johnna and Jessie, thank you for joining us and taking part in the online festival.
Thank you, Youssef.
Absolutely. Johnna is a violinist and graduate of Columbia University with double bachelor's degrees in biology and musicology. She has a master's of music from the Juilliard School and has a strong interest in improvisation. A great bulk of this interest has culminated in her becoming the founder of the group PinkNoise. Jessie Cox is a composer and a drummer, as well as a PhD student at Columbia. Less than 3 years ago, he released his Art Note Ensemble album, which can be described as avant-garde contemporary jazz and or electronic music. So one of the earliest findings in music psychology is the fact that the speed or accuracy of a performance is insufficient to make a musical impression on people. This means that perfect computer renditions of classical scores do not have the lasting appeal of more spontaneous human renditions. And I encourage any pushback on this if you have any. Um, in other words, you have to go beyond the page, or in a more meta sense, you have to go beyond what can be prepared. And variation is an asset by this metric of making an impression. So to start us off, I want to ask you, Jessie, about improvisation and how spontaneity is prepared, or whether it needs to be prepared in order to merge composition and improvisation.
Thank you for this question. I think I'm gonna sort of answer this in a sort of sidestep, because the question kind of, at the end you put improvisation and composition as sort of like two opposite poles. But I think what you first said when you were thinking through the computer playing music and the interpretation, it really brings up how much improvisation and composition are not actually opposite poles, but they're related in a different way. So I'm interested in that a lot, actually, in my music, in sort of the intertextuality, the interpretive, and the multicultural way that, you know, different cultures hear different words, for example, things like that. So that's the first part of the answer, I would say. So in that sense, every time I write, even just normative, you know, musical notes, I still see that there is improvisation happening. It's just a question of what kind of improvisation at that point for me.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think that leads nicely into an introduction of PinkNoise, the group, Johnna, you founded, for which improvisation is a core principle. So what is PinkNoise, and why does improvisation matter to you?
Thank you, Youssef, for your great questions. So PinkNoise is a sound wave, basically a sound frequency, kind of like white noise, but with lower frequencies. And Jessie was the one to tell me, and I think Jessie knows more about this than I do, that the frequencies are more equal somehow. So it's a type of sound essentially, and yeah. So why that group matters so much to me is that I have been improvising with various musicians outside of my classical training for several years now. And when I was in Berlin, I was involved in the Excite scene, and that was a really eye-opening experience for me. And I really wanted to have that same experience here in New York, and I wanted to continue improvising with people. But I wanted to also kind of bring that with my classical training, with my strong interest in contemporary music as well. So that kind of led me down an entirely different path of music making. And I treasure all of the musicians who are in this ensemble with me, because everybody is willing to take this risk as people who have grown accustomed to learning, reading, and performing from a score. It's a step away from that to be spontaneous and to be creative in the moment, and to create noise where, you know, where otherwise we would think that it's not permitted. So yeah, it does mean a lot to me.
So there's a lot of, in my field, there's a lot of like creating music based on models using like corpus of music. Do either of you have strong beliefs on whether or not computers can improvise?
Absolutely. Yes.
So,
Oh, yeah, me too, I think. I mean, I studied with George Lewis, who is a pioneer, I would say, in that field of improvising computers. And actually, we use a little excerpt from one of the performances of his piece Voyager for the score in our new work with PinkNoise.
so do you think that that finding I was talking about with computer renditions of like a Bach piece, for example, is like less appealing to someone than a human rendition? Is that because that's not really improvisation and that's a little bit more predictive? Like, why do you think that might be something that we find?
I feel like that might be the specific, you know, technology that's doing the rendition, like the specific kind that is built, because I think that's something that George's Voyager, but he talks a lot about, is that, you know, Voyager has an identity that he built it to have. So it is an individual in that sense. And I guess that means one needs to allow the computer software to have an individuality. And of course, that means you have to think differently about how you deal with technology. And the question of how we deal with technology is, you know, it's the same with the piano or the violin or the drums, right? They're technologies too. So how, you know, do we allow them to speak, and how do we see them, and how do we, you know, relate to them? Things like that, I think, is very important.
Joanna, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so part of what we do with PinkNoise is improvising with electronics, and we work very closely with Simon Kanzler, who's a composer as well, an electronic artist. And what we do is he's invented and coded his own live improvisation software, essentially. And so it essentially reacts in real time to what is being played and who is being processed. So we have a microphone, and our sound directly goes into his system, and whatever he chooses to do with it becomes his instrument. So you know, this whole idea of technology and agency with making music, you know, I do think that it's still a very creative human thing, because all this coding and all of these ideas going to, you know, creating a type of sound that the composer has in mind. And whatever this comes out, you know, it's what the composer or the performer chooses to do with these sounds, and how, you know, how one interacts with it, that makes it, you know, improvisation, that makes it really appealing music, right? It's not just that anything that a computer generates becomes music, right? It's how we curate it, it's how we interact with the sounds that come from it, and what we want to put into it. So it's still very much a human invention, like very much within the realm of human creativity.
And it sort of lets the computer do some of its own thing, even though you're programming it, which is where the computer improvises, I guess, is how I would see it.
Yeah, there's a surprising element to it too, right? There's a whole dimension that you can't control at the same time. You know, there's this you know, there are these sounds that will come out that you don't anticipate but are still beautiful, that you can still do something with. And I think that's also something really amazing.
Commission Black as a Hack for Cyborgification. It's a tongue twister for me. Cyborgification.
Yes.
It's such a great title. Yeah.
I mean, it's related to that, like that thinking through of technology and thinking through of what human or humanism is. I'm of course evoking Donna Haraway and the cyborg studies and these kind of things, but also the Black as a Hack is actually something Tony Coates, the artist, mentioned as an idea in one of his texts. And it's a fascinating idea because it made me think about this, you know, it's kind of like not supposed to be in the system, but it's in the system, you know, this sort of virus attribute or something. So I was thinking, just asking these questions, you know, what is a cyborg? You know, what is it to be Black? What is it to be not part of the system, to be an alien, just like I am actually an alien in America, and so forth. And there's so many, you know, alien situations right now that we're dealing with, like coronavirus, or, you know, when we had the protests and suddenly two alien planets met or collided. That's how I see it, because a lot of science fiction novelists would talk about, you know, how Black world in America is a different planet to the white middle class experience, and so forth. So these are all these questions. And then there's the Creole-ness, which to me is also sort of cyborgian situation. And then also that we're all cyborgs too, you know, that the way we think is changed because we have Google, you know, or the way we make music now has also changed because we have to use Zoom and Jamkasan and things like that. So there's all these sort of moments that are improvisational meetings, I would say, where we have a dialogue, where something's happening that has to do with, you know, confronting otherness or alienness. And I think that there is a lot of, I guess, knowledge or study that has been done by certain artists and thinkers that sometimes we don't include in this kind of discourse, but that, or that, you know, they don't include each other, but that I wanted to bring together as well. So then, you know, people like Glissant, and then bring in Sun Ra at the same time, and the orchestra, who deal a lot with the question of alienation, right? And they bring in Lachenmann with his work on, you know, instruments, which is an interesting exploration of materialities, materialisms, and new materialism then can come in, of course. So it's this sort of space that I wanted to create. And this is also kind of how the piece is structured. There's these different spaces that the musicians learn, and then we have to get to know these spaces that we create through music making, and that we also interact in and are in, find agency in, during the same process of making music together.
So it's my understanding that we have a rehearsal clip of this, of Black as a Hack for Cyborgification. I think, Johnna, you have it, right?
Yes. Go.
It'd be cool to listen to it.
Yay.
Pretty,
Wow.
very cool.
Yeah.
So the piece is like 8.5 minutes long, or does that vary?
It varies.
Undetermined. Cool.
Varies. depending on when I give a signal. Yeah.
So it's kind of a privilege to have both of you here because you were performing the piece, Johnna, and you were the composer, Jessie. So we often have the opportunity of having a composer in the audience, but it's rare that we get to hear a performance of the piece and then hear the performer and composer interact. So I was wondering if this commission provided either or both of you with new insight on the relationship between composer and performer, or new insights on each other, if that's more interesting.
Absolutely. So this is the first time that I've worked with a composer like Jessie who also performed in the piece and also guided us through the entire creative process. How it usually works for me is that I'm given a sheet of paper with impossible notes and I'm told what I'm doing well or mostly what I'm doing not so well. And then I practice and practice until the day of the performance, and whatever happens, happens. I'm usually very nervous. And it's a cycle that repeats over and over again. When I play very, very complicated pieces, which I also love, it's another process. But working with Jessie has been an extremely amazing experience because we get to see his creative process. Like we got to see clips of Sun Ra's piece and Count Ossie and George Lewis, and we got to see what they brought on the Voyager and how that inspired this work. And we heard clips of NASA's recordings of certain planets and how that, inspired him to create certain sounds. And also with him as a percussionist, because he's also an amazing performer. He just brought so many brilliant sounds and made us, like, really pushed us to create things that we never would have known that we had ourselves.
Thank you for these kind words. It makes me happy to hear that. That's kind of my goal actually as a composer, because that's how I think of composition. And especially this piece, I didn't know what would happen at all because it's kind of strange. You have these individual sheets of papers and they're, full of complex notation, like as complex as you could get, and, full of it. So you have, these are what I call these spaces, right? So you have one that's maybe a sun, one is called Mercury, another one Venus. And so I wrote these individual sheets and then I wanted to put them somehow together. And then I was like, oh, I really like the idea. Yes, this is the image. So these are individual spaces that we created together and that we were also inside and having conversations in, and all kind of things happened inside these spaces that we created at the same time. Yes, and then I put them into this structure, which was kind of like a neural network. Maybe you can show that.
Yeah.
So basically, I just decided, let's make a neural network. I just put everything into a neural network, and sort of like a statistical distribution of the amounts of things, of space 1 or space 2. And so when we rehearsed together, it was very interesting because first, what happens is, you first have to do this whole process of improvising, namely improvising your reading. This is kind of maybe explaining a bit what I meant at the beginning with improvisation happens when you read. When you see that, that one of these sheets of papers with this complex notation or simple notation, doesn't really matter, then, you have to understand it. But maybe there is something I wrote for, flute, but you play cello. So how are you going to, say the same thing? So it was a very interesting process to do that with PinkNoise. Like we were, I think, 8 people. So 8 different instruments, very diverse set of instruments looking at this. and really talking to each other about what it could mean, and what are possibilities inside that space as well, and then exploring that together, and then even exploring how can we interact, because also every single person there has completely different take on music, on life. Different cultures are represented in the ensemble too, and so when I was happy that it worked, that we had suddenly a space and we were all able to bring in different things, at different times, and to really be ourselves, and also at the same time interact in this very deep way, and also sometimes not.
Yeah, and we created a space within a space, essentially, because we did this all virtually,
Right.
all within
Right.
this period online with Jamkazam. And that was frustrating, given all the glitches, but once it worked, it was really kind of amazing. So
Yeah, the space within the space is also the space that music makes. It's very I think I remember very viscerally when I first experienced that was when I was at the Cecil Taylor conference, and they were playing Cecil Taylor piece, and I just received news that a friend of mine was banned from coming to this country for 10 years. And then I realized suddenly that this music, the music that Cecil Taylor wrote, that then these musicians were playing there, which sometimes people call free jazz. You can call it whatever you want, but what it did, it created a space. It made, through making music, there was a space within which you could be, even though you might not be allowed. And that was kind of maybe a sort of deeper desire of mine in this piece, to get to do something like that.
yeah, and I think one concept that you brought up earlier that really resonates with me is kind of the idea of not being allowed into a certain space, being an alien, being a cyborg, essentially, feeling that way. I mean, obviously, I, my parents now live in China after moving there after 25 years in the U.S. But still, there's always this sense of, well, like, wow, I don't know what kind of music represents me in the best way that I can. And that was one of the things that kind of led me to improvisation, because it kind of seemed like it tapped into the part of me that, that was the most immediate, and it, like, I didn't have to play through a filter in any sense, and I could play in any style, so to say, as I wanted to. And I didn't, it's hard, and it's also so hard to find Western music that kind of represents my experience as being, an immigrant, and being like feeling like an alien, especially, even when I'm playing classical music, the stuff that I love, and that I've grown up with. And so I think playing, collaborating with you and playing music like this is kind of like, well, I understand, like I get it in a way, that, it speaks to a little bit to my experience, and I can tap into my own experience playing, how I want to bring to the music, and what I can bring to the music in my own way as well. If that makes any sense.
I come from an Egyptian family. I think we all have like sort of an eclectic thing, because the Western music onto our own upbringing with different, yeah. So
Yeah.
I think we're pushing 30 here. It would be nice to end with an improvisation. Thank you, Johnna and Jessie, so much for speaking with us. And
Thank
so,
you.
Johnna, whenever you're ready, the MacBook screen is yours.
Okay, thank you so much.